as you would for a trout, because you won't set the hook. The mullet has a very tough upper lip, and the hook won't penetrate. And after the first one, you'll lose your fish almost certainly. So head drifting towards hopefully showing as simple as that. The flies that we would use, good drifting flies are diveheads. Shrimps called mud shrimps, so their Latin name is Carofim volutator. So there's a very limited period of time for the mullet to claim these shrimps before they return to the safety of their underground burrows. So that's why you'll see thin-lipped mullet with their backs out of the water, really rushing into shallow water to grab these shrimps before they escape to their burrows. So there's two flies to imitate the mud shrimps. One is the flexi shrimp, obviously brown, and that's because shrimps in that sort of environment tend to be brown. And the other fly is imaginatively called a mud shrimp, or Carofim volutator as the Latin name. The approach for these fish as they're feeding on the shrimp in the very shallow water is to stand in slightly deeper water. You've got to be careful when mud's involved, don't go in a soft area, safety first. But where there's mud banks, there tends to be areas of gravel between them where the water scours through, and you can stand on those quite safely. So that gives you a good vantage point behind the fish. You can see them as they progress over the mud, hunting down the shrimp. Simply a case of drop the flies where the fish are feeding in amongst them, let them settle for a few seconds, and then a few quick strips is usually all it takes. The problem then, of course, is that you've got anchor ropes and chains where yachts are present, because they tend to feed around yachts on mud banks. So you have to be ready for the first run for the nearest anchor rope or chain. So it makes it very exciting to hold the fish back and see it jump, and they give a good fight. Thin lips tend to be in the 2 to 3 pound range in that sort of environment. Up rivers, I had my first experience of that a few weeks ago. Somebody contacted me to say that they'd found shoals of thin lips well upriver, but they were having difficulty catching them. So we met up and tried with the normal tactics of diebass and spectra shrimps, but we got no response at all, even though there were quite good shoals present. We then hatched a plan based on a technique to catch thin-lip mullet using MEPS spinners tipped off with ragworm, and the flexiworm has accounted for many mullet for myself over the years, and it's been suggested to me by quite a few people that represents a ragworm, or harbour rag it's called specifically, which is a small red ragworm. So we popped one of those on the point fly, and next cast we had interest straight away, and a few casts later a fish came in and took a dieback that was on the dropper. So it's almost as if the flexiworm acted as an attractor in some ways. They started to pull at the flexifloss legs as well, which was quite annoying. But yeah, so we managed to get success, and that's a technique that now seems to work. The third type of mullet that's available to us in the UK is the golden grey mullet. They tend to be found on sandy beaches, mainly in the south of the country, south coast of England, Cornwall, Devon. South Wales is a real hotspot. Hampshire and Sussex, we don't have sandy beaches there to any great extent, but even a small sandy bay, 30 metres wide, they will come and feed there because sand is what they look for. The best technique for catching golden greys is to enter the water behind the shoal. Again, they will feed on the advancing tide, right on the edge of the tide. As the waves break over the sand, they're just behind because the sand stirs up food and they're ready to pounce. So that the angler takes up position behind the golden greys, maybe 15 yards behind. Probably the best fly in that situation again is the flexiworm. Because as I've explained, it's taken as some kind of marine worm. That's a very good technique. If it's not working, or if there's insufficient waves to generate food for them, then they will simply patrol on the flood and tide maybe for an hour or so until they eventually find food, and then they'll start to feed quite fervently. In that situation, the dieback that we looked at earlier is a good fly. And the spectra shrimp as well. In other words, you're starting to pull them slowly in front of the fish rather than allowing the worm fly to just roll around in the wash and be discovered by the golden grey. So that's the three environments that you'll traditionally find these fish in, and the techniques to catch them. There's been some advancements in the last year or so that's produced some really exciting fishing under quite different circumstances. One was on a surf beach in Wales, typical golden grey type surf beach, but the difference with this surf beach is that all three species of mullet can be caught there at the same time. And the reason for that is the presence of an algae which forms as the water warms up. Algae is common all around the British Isles, the North Sea, so lots of European coasts have it as well. It's usually seen as white foam, but once it blooms, algae blooms like a flower. After it does it, it dies. And once it dies, it turns brown. And the brown decaying algae is deposited on the sand. And it's very easy to see the areas where the algae has been deposited. As you walk down the beach, and these beaches tend to be 3 miles long or more, beautiful long surf beaches, you'll see pristine white breakers crashing onto the beach, and every 100 yards or so you'll see a 20-yard wide strip of brown water, and that brown water is caused by the presence of the algae. And wherever you find the algae in the water, then you'll find fish without a doubt, and it can be any of the three species. It just depends on which shoal we come across. So you have a very good chance of a grand slam, a mullet grand slam in a situation like that. So that's been tremendous fishing. We've tried and failed to produce an algae fly, a fly that looks like a bit of the algae. Typically is probably the size of a 10-pence piece. It's brown and bubbly, a bit like the inside of an aero bar, and it floats on the water as the tide comes in. It picks it up, and the fish follow and eating it. So you'll see thousands of fish basically 20 yards from shore eating on this algae, but if you spent all day covering them with flies and slowly stripping them through, you'd probably catch one or two, maybe miss a few more. And it's wonderfully exciting as well, very visual. But the most effective technique has been discovered by a Welsh guy called Darren Jackson, and he ignores the fish that are 20 yards offshore, and instead he targets fish that are within a few feet of the edge of the water, in water that's probably 6 inches deep. As the surf pushes in the waves, you get these water tables forming, which are maybe 20 yards wide, 30 yards wide, 6 inches deep or so. And in there, often concealed, are good numbers of decent fish. The first time most fishers realise they're there is as they walk in the water and spook them, and they just go shooting off into the surf. So Darren came up with the technique of ignoring the fish further out, looking along the wash for little groups of fish feeding on shrimps rather than the algae, and he'll creep along, often on his hands and knees for the last few yards, to take up position. And as the water rushes out and leaves dry sand, the fish go with it. They will then come back in with it within seconds as a new wave forms and a new table pushes up, and then you need to be in position waiting for the fish to come back in on the table, and then it's sight fishing from that point of view. You can see which way they're moving, and you just drop the flies in front of them. The flies which are really successful there, again, are the spectra shrimp, and the ghostbuster. That's good in the very shallow water. They'll take a ghostbuster as well, and the dieback. The dieback is practically the same as this one here, but we put a sparkly tail on. Instead of a feather tail, we put a bit of crystal flash on and give it a rib of crystal flash as well, and that seems to make a difference in these conditions. The fish will take a sparkly dieback more readily than the normal red-headed one. The other fly that we've had some success with is the Rome's shrimp. I created that one during the winter specifically for this festival, to fish over sand for golden greys. I trialled it in Spain in June, and it caught mullet straight away, so it's done well, and it's caught fish on the surf beach in Wales as well. So the message really about the surf beach is we have sandy surf beaches in many areas of the UK, and if we have this algae forming, I've done some research and apparently it's very widespread, and if there's mullet in the area as well, then the chances are that where you find the algae, you'll find mullet. The really interesting thing about the algae is that it's a very common algal bloom. While it's living, it appears as white foam, and it's actually toxic to the fish and marine life at that point in time. But once it blooms, when algae blooms, it's like a massive cell division, at which point it then dies. Once it dies, it turns brown and decays, and as soon as it's decaying, it releases carbohydrates and sugars such as polysaccharides. So the algae in its brown form is basically an energy drink, and that's why the fish go looking for it. And these fish, as a result of feeding on this energy drink day in, day out throughout the summer, are wonderfully fit, large specimens of fish and put up a fantastic fight. So that's really worthwhile checking out. And that fishing is probably the most exciting fishing I've experienced ever. It's that good. I'm often asked about the sort of equipment to use, and like the tactics we use, it's very straightforward and simple. Normal trout rods, preferably 5 weights, 6 weights are ideal, and it's always a floating line that we use because the shoals are always encountered in shallow water, so you need a floating line, especially when you want the flies to drift in the current. A floating line aids that. If the line passes over a shoal of fish, it doesn't disturb them or spook them in any way, and they'll simply swim under it. If it was an intermediate line, they'd probably be touching the line and may become spooked, so floating line. You do get saltwater specific outfits. Many companies now produce 6-weight rods, but if a 5-weight, at this point in time, you'll have to use a freshwater rod or a river rod. A grey Streamflex 5-weight is perfect, quite sensitive, and the advantage of using a 5 or 6-weight outfit as well is when the fish are feeding in very shallow water, you want the impact of the fly line landing to be as delicate as possible. If you use a 9 weight, as many saltwater fishers do, then it's got all the delicacy of a felled tree falling on the water in front of them, and it will certainly spook them. So go light, that's the best way. The leaders I use tend to be 12 feet long, and I like to use one dropper about 3 feet up from the point to keep the flies quite close together. I used to fish with 2 droppers, but found that I rarely, if ever, caught a fish on the top dropper. And if conditions are windy, then it's more prone to tangling, so one dropper's a good idea. I just tie the leaders straight through, no tapered leaders. The small flies, these flies are size 12, so they're very easy to turn over. You tend to be creeping up on the mullet, so there's no long distance casts involved. So if you're not the greatest caster in the world, then mullet fishing's probably for you. Leader fluorocarbon I prefer myself for several reasons. One is the fact that it's practically invisible in water and less likely to spook the fish. Mullet have some of the best eyesight of any fish that swims, so you don't want to see the leader. The other thing is that salt water is more buoyant than fresh water, so the fact that fluorocarbon is heavier than nylon or copolymer and sinks more quickly, that's in your favour as well. You don't want to see the leader curled up on the surface, catching the sunlight, because that really will spook the fish. Really, that's it. Very simple. The tactics sound simple because they are. The most important thing is to find shoals, and find shoals that are feeding. When they're feeding, you'll see they suddenly become animated, they'll swim quickly, they'll splash and swirl, turn on their sides and give silver flashes. That's an indication that they're turning to pick up food. So when you see that, that's the time to get your flies in amongst them, and you will almost certainly hook up. Good luck.